Hi, my name's Hannes, and in this video I want to start a new project. So I've purchased a lot of Space Marines, and I've built none of them. They're all still sat in their sprues in grey plastic in these boxes. And here's my confession to make, I suppose. I don't really like Firstborn Marines that much. I think they look a bit derpy. They come with a lot of nostalgia for me, but they just don't look right somehow. And I remember as a kid that used to really bother me as well. And I think the Primaris Marines are such a step up. They look so good. Okay, GW didn't handle it right, and realistically they should have just replaced units that used to exist with new units and a new scale. But they're also a company trying to make money, and compared to lots of other companies, they're not that bad, I suppose. Okay, they're not great, but they're not that bad. But never mind, I have a lot of Marines. And the big problem, and the reason they're all still sat in boxes, is because I couldn't pick a colour scheme. I've owned this box for over a year and all of the Marines are still in grey plastic and they're still on their sprues. So, here's my idea. Pick a chapter that I've always liked, build a story, a new world, something to make it my own, and then create that chapter. So, what I've decided, which might be obvious to you watching at home, is that I'm going to pick my personal favourite chapter of the Loyalist Marines, which is the Space Wolves. I'm going to create my own reason for a Primaris successor chapter to exist, and then I'm going to paint them in the traditional Space Wolf style. These 3 boxes, plus some upgrade sprues, are a brilliant start. There's a ton of them, but it's a brilliant start to get me going. So that's kind of what this video is. It's sort of a narrative story of the successor chapter I want to form, and me trying out some different painting techniques on a test model to see what works. So I hope you enjoy. The second founding of Space Marine chapters is famous for its success in reinventing the front line of the God Emperor's war machine. The Space Marine legions had always been the scalpel that cut deep, as the human forces of the Astra Militarum were often the hammer that would crush anyone in humanity's way, all to glory the death cult of mankind. The Space Marine Legion, perhaps known to fight with an animalistic ferocity, were the Space Wolves. That same ferocity brought even their Astartes brothers to their knees at Prospero. They were always the enforcers of Imperial order, no matter the cost. They were in the later millenniums known as a more caring set of Astartes, or at least by Astartes standards, and an army that was both famed for its abilities to stand alone, even against the Imperial order, and an army that cared deeply about its own traditions, rights, and rules. The High Lords of Terror had always held the chapter in some suspicion, as their gene seed was unstable and they would often do whatever it really was that they wished. The Lords had long since known that the Wolves of Fenris would be key to the continued survival of the Imperium, but they had long since hoped that they would be more compliant to the wishes of Terror. Thus a plan was hatched. What if a Primaris Space Wolf successor could be created, but with no knowledge of the chapter they were founded from? The idea being that their ferocity and strength, their willingness to do what was needed to be done, could be passed on without the issues that tarred their reputations. This is the founding of the Fang of Terror, a legion that was created to be entirely compliant with the needs of the High Lords. Their gene seed proved to be slightly more stable than the wolves from which they were founded in this new Primaris form, and they showed great promise. The chapter master Marcus Rathven was groomed from a young age for leadership, picked due to aptitude tests all Marines of the chapter were subjected to. The Fang of Terror received a fleet of 20 vessels, led by the Watcher of Night, a behemoth of ships even by imperial standards. They were under orders to avoid all other Astartes. They were a weapon to be wielded according to the politics of the High Lords, when those same lords did not wish to be seen. Their armour was a pure jet black, no markings or signifiers, just silent killers coming out of the night. This proved successful in their first 2 decades of action. Firstly, they were sent to colour rebellion near the Eye of Terror on a small industrial planet called Hexonium, and instead of just quelling that rebellion, they slaughtered the entire leadership of the planet. By the time they were done, there was no one left to incite any form of rebellion, and the local populace was so terrified that their production increased. This was seen as a great success, and that planet never had another rebellion of its form again. There was even a religion formed of Dark Watchers that saw all evil or sin that they did. Soon, they were assigned to kill a small outpost of Black Shields. The Black Shields were on an ancient space station armed to the teeth with nuclear missiles, laser batteries and shields that repelled and redirected nearby asteroids. The base itself was in the middle of a cluster of them, and nigh on impossible to assault without heavy damages. Marcus Rathven himself led a charge of gunships darting through the asteroids and using them as shields, then landing on foot to the outside of the base. Instead of directly fighting their foe, he ordered his Marines to lay charges and then take off. The outer casing of the base ruptured, and it was the asteroids themselves that defended the station that doomed the rebellious Astartes inside. They had many successful missions like this, and as a result of their actions, rumours began to circulate of an efficient force throughout the Imperium, but one that was unknown and hidden from other Marines. The life of the chapter was simple. They received orders via astropathic communication, dealt with whichever threat they were pointed at, then moved on until the next set of orders were received. After many successful operations, they stopped for refueling as a wound in the sky ripped open over them. The blue wave of monstrosities were over their vessels before anyone could react. The chapter fought with everything they had, outnumbered, surrounded, and constantly losing grounds on their own ships. It was like every vessel seemed in an instant to have revealed an infestation of demons that had been there for years. The Marines of the chapter began to fight with a ferocity they did not recognize. Some of their number would tear into their opponents like they were hunting for jewels or gold in the flesh of their foe. 300 human cultists of Tzeentch landed on one vessel, and when their Tsangor reinforcements followed, they only found the ground of the vessels caked in blood and gore, with an inhuman rage carried out on any who dared board the vessels. Most of the chapter's attacks had been surgical up until this point. However, this was something altogether different. Something had awoken in them. The Marines who managed to arm themselves or who had been in training at the time made quick work of the force once the chaos had settled. They relished the destruction. As the tide was turning, however, a Lord of Change grabbed the chapter master and they both disappeared in a cloud of smoke that rippled with a pure yet uncanny light. Although the chapter survived and losses were technically minimal, the Marines of this chapter felt a longing to kill and the loss of their leadership. Marcus Rathven was the only leader they had ever known, the only one they were trained to trust, and he was taken by a force they could not follow. The chapter would never fully recover from this moment. After this moment, initially they became utterly ineffective. The chapter created in secret was now out of their master's control. A commander by the name of Ivan Kelper rallied the chapter into a counterattack to save Marcus Rathven. They sought to travel into the Eye of Terror to seek revenge and restitution, a feat they would fail to achieve. They entered the Eye and sought out opponents for years. However, they never found anything. It appeared as if the forces were playing a game with them, directing them away from any who might find them. A cloud of warp energy was often seen like a pilot fish, watching and following the vessels, shadowing their every move. One Marine, 2 years into this aimless trip, claimed to see Rathvin himself walking under the eaves of a training room. Their lead astropath claimed to see a Lord of Change in his dreams before killing himself. The men stopped training in their routines after the 3rd year. Kelpin had led the chapter into this grand action. Clearly, however, others outside of their control wished for it to be a failure. As they left the Eye, having wasted years of their lives, they sought redemption, a redemption that would soon deliver itself. Dating messages from Terra revealed that the years they had lost was only 3 months in real time. Many feared they'd all gone mad. Unsure of what to do, Kelpa sent a message reporting the failure of the chapter to their old masters, noting in a special detail some of the things they had seen. The years of pent-up rage and no outlet had been very hard on the chapter. The madness of their forebears was beginning to take hold. The rage that guided them was totalizing, and their wish for carnage was becoming uncontrollable. The rank and file of Kelpa's men started presenting weird behavior, animalistic traits were common, and they were finding discipline was becoming capital in nature. Despite losing their control, they did respond to a call for help. They arrived at a planet of no seeming import to find a destroyed Imperium outpost, surrounded by carnage and destruction as 20 space wolves were making their final valiant stand against a greenskin horde. The Space Wolves were taking out many of their foe for each one of them lost, but it was a game of attrition, and there was next to none of them left. The Fang of Terror had spent years training in vessels in the murky sea of the warp, and were finally unleashed. An entire chapter of Marines fighting all at once is a near unstoppable force. Ships landing from every angle, the rumble of gun batteries and Thunderhawk jets creates a wall of sonic pressure. The Greenskins probably felt very happy that day. They got to do the things that they loved. Fighting, and more than that, fighting some Space Marines that were only meagre in force, but still would put up a decent fight. Some Humies to crump. They barely got to fight the Fang of Terror. It must have been one amazing sight for them to see the engines of war appearing out of the sky. However, they didn't live long enough to revel in the fighting. A wolf lord by the name of Jarl Darkfang and his men had just been saved. They were transported upon the Watcher of the Night to feast with the remaining leaders of the Fangs of Terror force. Darkfang immediately recognized the problems Kelpa's men were having. They were succumbing to the excesses of the same gene seed that he had felt his entire life. He ordered his rune priest to aid the chapter and help them learn more of the great ocean and calm their excesses. The political forces that had seen the rise of the chapter had done their best to hide their founding. Now the chapter was out of their control, and even worse, had contacted their brethren. There would have been little they could have done if it were not for the vivid reports from Kelpa of the things they saw in the Eye of Terror. In the eyes of Holy Terror itself, then, the chapter had lost their minds, disobeyed orders, and openly admits to seeing apparitions and not stopping them. The Space Wolves were ordered to destroy the chapter at once and rid the Imperium of the potential problem. Logan Grimnar himself, recognizing its opportunity to do some good, offered them an alternate solution. The Fang of Terror were brutal, cunning at times, and had proven themselves, at least in his eyes. Instead of killing them, Grimnar ordered that the colours of their armour were to change to match the Space Wolves themselves. They would have to find a new home, but they should do so under the leadership and guidance of someone he could trust. As such, he ordered that they find another chapter, also thought to be a secret founding, called the Violet Wyverns. The problem though, this chapter was on the other side of the Cicatrix Maledictum. They were being sent on a saga to prove their worth. As their vessels were restocked for their voyage, Ivan Kelper met with Grimnar to ask for some aid. The chapter had been lost ever since the disappearance of Rathvin, and he felt he had not proved to be a good replacement. After their discussion, Kelper was introduced to the leader that they required, Jarl Darkfang himself. He would steward them to the completion of their task, while at the same time proving himself after the loss of his own men. The trip itself was relatively uneventful despite the crossing. They managed to fend off some raiders, and when approaching the Great Rift itself, they found 2 other forces of greenskins attempting to control the gap they wished to use. Those 2 hordes fighting in the black had mostly crushed themselves. This was not really the victory the Fang of Terror were after. They arrived at the planet they'd been sent to find only a month later, a remarkable world that had the same temperament as the Holy Terror of old. Continents of varying size, large deep blue oceans, 2 icy poles crossing the north and south. Multiple human tribes lived in the planet, some in arid deserts, some in the northern tundra, and others in forested groves. The tribes were relatively primitive, hardy perhaps, some knowledge of mining, and some incredible metal work that their Mechanica maids could not fully understand. They themselves lived in relative peace, but seemed also to have a lot of defences in place. On the northern pole of the planet was a deserted structure of immense proportions that held on one of its great towers the symbol of the Imperial Eagle. It was older than the Imperium itself. Grand metallic gates towered over a city of interconnected buildings, a weapons battery on each side, and an aviary of some form on the roof that was filled not with birds or with creatures that were tamed by humans, but grand lizards, about 3 times the size of a Primaris Marine. When they landed, they expected a fight, but the lizards just watched them enter and seemed not to be fazed by their new neighbours. The palace itself was filled with everything a chapter would need to rearm and regrow. They had wanted a grand saga to find the planet with glory and distinction, but Jarl Darkfang advised that this potentially was their saga. This could be their base and their planet from which they would grow to prior strength. The base itself was spectacular. It contained records of the chapter that had lived there. The chapter master was called in one record the brother of Marcus Rathvin himself. This was another chapter formed in the same way, sent to a base the High Lords knew was empty, the seat of their strength for Imperium Nihilus perhaps. There was a set of mines that extended deep into the planet, foundries for their weapons, barracks for more men than they could ever hope to field. They tested the walls of the structure and found the metal subsurface that repelled most shots they could fire. The lizards, from which the violet wyverns that had held this base previously received their name, were a culture in their own right. They had been allowed to live as they respected strength, and it was the rite of passage of joining the violet wyverns to engage one in combat and live. The wyverns themselves seemed to use this as a form of peacocking as well, with the males watching each fight and mating only with the females that survived. The Fang of Terror had found their home. They had rituals to inherit, a foundry to use, and the strength to be reborn. After 2 months they were set up, rebounding and beginning the process of growing in strength. Jarl Darkfang was hailing this as their new beginning. Preparations were being made for future intakes, a day none of them thought they would ever see. A message arrived at this time from a Blood Angels commander on the edge of the subsector. He was travelling to their location to explore the missing chapter upon the orders of Dante. He was due to arrive in 4 months and wanted a full report on not only the chapter that had moved into their halls, but the state of that palace itself. This commander would arrive on time, but he would never meet the chapter who were now calling the palace their own.
So yeah, I never claimed to be a writer. That is not necessarily my talent. But I did really enjoy this actually. It's just a chance to sit down and to sort of mess about with some ideas. particularly as someone who has sort of dived headfirst into the Black Library novels of late. This is my chapter. This is the heavy narrative part of the story out the way. What makes this chapter very particularly interesting to me will come in part 2, which is going to be much less narrative and much more talking about what we're going to be doing with these models. But I'm afraid you're probably going to have to wait a few weeks for that one, given that I've got quite a few projects on the go now. So at least for now, I hope you've enjoyed it. I've been Hannes, this has been Painting by Letters, and keep safe out there.